Thanks, Uri. Good evening, everyone. Well, good evening from Berlin. It's dark here and cold. Where you are, it's warm and sunny and light. So lucky you. So I had a great honor of being asked to chair, mentor, whatever, the very talented pair of junior scientists, Kristina Krasich and Samuel Murray. And we met and we discussed the science, and in the end, there is a presentation today, and I really enjoyed these interactions. And I brought you a slide, just to introduce you to the two. Can you see this? You should be able to see the slide now. Okay. So I'm just going to tell you very briefly who the two are. So Kristina Krasich is at Duke University, Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. Surprise, surprise. And Samuel is also at Duke University, but in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. But Kristina's, if I'm correct with saying it, phrasing it this way, has a more experimental lean, and Samuel has also a theoretical, conceptual lean. Kristina did her BA in psychology and English at Duke, then went on to do an MA at Notre Dame, and then PhD again at Notre Dame. And Samuel did a BA in philosophy and humanities in 2012, and then did his PhD at Notre Dame as well. I don't really have very much to say other than that I'm absolutely fascinated by these two brilliant researchers, and I'm sure they both have shining and bright careers ahead, as you will see in a second.
And Kristina, do you want to ask for the remote access? There we go. Okay. So thanks to John for that introduction, and also for finding probably the best available picture of me online and using that in the introduction slide. And thanks also to everybody for tuning in. We're excited to talk about some of this research and also some of the sort of conceptual foundations for the research, and then to discuss it more in the question and answer session. So we're honored to be here, and we're honored that you're giving us your attention. So we all know that most of what we do as agents involves the execution of different long-term intentions with these little bursts of episodic activity. So I've, on the one hand, got this plan to be more healthy that involves picking out good recipes in the morning, going and picking up healthy ingredients at the grocery store around 4, going to the gym at 5:30. Actually, as a side note, this list was written long before I had children, so it doesn't, this plan sort of went out the window at this point. But anyway, and then picking a healthy snack at 9 p.m. Actually, that part hasn't changed that much. My plan to learn Spanish involves going to class on Tuesday and Thursday and using a language learning app Monday and Wednesday at 7 a.m. and then also watching a Spanish language film on Saturday evenings, or at least trying to. The kids kind of changed that. I've also got this plan to write papers. It involves reading articles, writing outlines, producing drafts, reading more articles, and so on. So these kinds of routines and activities are part of our ordinary engagement with the world. But what Kristina and I are interested in is understanding what's required of us as agents to create, maintain, and then at the appropriate time, implement an extended and intentionally connected series of activities like this. Or in other words, what's required of us as agents to act on temporally extended plans. Right at the outset, we want to dismiss the idea that it's just a matter of maintaining a set of intentions of which I have a current awareness at all times. I've got, well, probably hundreds, thousands of plans, depending on how you individuate them. And I rarely give much thought to any of them at any particular time or for very long. Instead, what I think I've got is a suite of dispositional states that have to be activated at the appropriate time or on an appropriate occasion. What I mean by that is I'm disposed to sort of shift back and forth between different intentions or between different parts of my plan at different times, depending on what I deem appropriate. So another way to put these sort of central questions is, what are these dispositional states? How do they arise? How are they maintained? And what triggers their activation? And so in this talk, we're going to start to lay out some of the answers to these questions. And what we find, or what we think we found, is that our answers sort of invoke elements that aren't parts of the standard accounts of theories of action. And we also think that these novel elements give us the resources to explain interesting phenomena, like the role of quality of will and acting over time, but also the possibility of being responsible for omissions that have no free or intentional acts on our part. Okay, so that's sort of the map of where we want to go. And we want to start with this claim that acting on a plan requires more than just intentions. So actions are movements that are, here we go. Actions are movements that are guided and initiated by an intention. This notion of guidance has recently figured prominently in discussions of the nature and dynamics of action. And it's kind of following up on some suggestive early work by Harry Frankfurt and Irving Thalberg, Miles Brand, and also Robert Audi. But we want to suggest that acting on a plan requires more than just guidance. And this is partly a function of the kinds of actions that we undertake as the sorts of agents we are. So as we mentioned at the outset, we often want to accomplish many things that occur on indeterminate or overlapping timescales. And so we might engage in one activity for some amount of time before switching to something else. We call these intermittent actions scattered actions. And a series of scattered actions might look something like this. So for scattered actions, the intentions that are associated with particular activities aren't always guiding the behavior. So you can see there's this gap, like the intention to A1 isn't always guiding the behaviors. There's a shift to A2, a shift to A3, back and forth. So the intentions associated with particular activities aren't always guiding behavior. So there's something besides the intention that must coordinate how the agent implements scattered actions over time. We can bring out this difference between guidance and coordination by thinking about situations where scattered agency breaks down. So consider this case of what we're going to call skipping, right? So suppose I want to leave my office at the end of the day, stop at the library to pick up a book before heading to my car to go home and do some grading in the evening. But as I'm packing up to leave the office, I'm so engrossed in this problem that I'm working on, a problem I've identified and something I'm working on, and I'm so fixated on it that I end up walking right past the library and going straight to my car, only realizing later in the evening that I never stopped to get the book that I wanted to look at. So what's going on in a case like this? So the first thing to note is that at each time point, you've got behavior that's guided by an intention. And moreover, these are plan relevant intentions insofar as they conform to things that I had planned earlier to do at some point during the day. What's going on is that there's this key node in the plan that fails to get activated. And this failure isn't an issue of guidance. Rather, it's just that the intention simply wasn't brought to mind. So we think there are two lessons to draw out here. The first is that guided behavior doesn't constitute coordination over time on its own. Guidance is essential for acting at a time, but simple agglomeration of guided behavior doesn't suffice for acting over time. We also think that guidance is a property of an occurrent mental state, or at least a relation between an occurrent mental state and some behavior. But scattered agency isn't fully mediated by occurrent mental states. We've got a shift between occurrent and prospective intentions, and this shifting isn't under the purview of guidance. So agents guide their behavior via intentions. This is what we could think of as first order guidance, if you wanted that label. But as planning agents, we want these behaviors to form coordinated sets as we act on multiple intentions over time. And what unifies these different behaviors into a coherent cross-temporal set is a plan, this kind of higher order cognitive state. And we think this is one way of thinking about what's going on in the skipping case is the agent's behavior is guided relative to a particular intention, right? The intention of leaving the office, getting to the car, going home, etc. But there's a failure to guide that behavior in light of this overarching plan. It was meant to unify these behaviors in a particular way. But we think that's not the full story of what's going on in this example, because plans are dispositional states. And as such, they require some further event that triggers their activation, at least on the assumption that actions are events and only events can be the causes of events. So we need to know how plans are structured such that relevant prompts elicit their execution. One proposal along this line is that plans include as part of their content information about when each part should be activated. And we're calling this the timestamp hypothesis. Timestamp is a little bit of a misleading, actually, I'll read the thing and talk about why it's misleading afterward. So for those so this is sort of Robert Audi's statement of the timestamp hypothesis. He doesn't use that label, but this is how he talks about it. So for those situations where practical judgment does not immediately issue an action, so that's a situation where you form an intention, but you want to execute it at some point in the non-immediate future. The resulting intention to act implies either in its content or in corresponding beliefs what would be an appropriate occasion for action. So on this view, plans are structured so as to indicate appropriate occasions for executing their parts. Upon perceiving a match between the timestamp and the present, one begins to act. Now, timestamp, as you can see from the quotation, it's not necessarily that information about timing is encoded. It could also be information about occasion. So you get this event-based information as well. But occasion stamp isn't a term that we use in English, and timestamp is. So it's sort of like a creative liberty. But don't get hung up too much on the idea of timing. So we think that the timestamp hypothesis isn't adequate for explaining the dynamics of acting on a plan or acting over time for many such instances. That shouldn't say false. This was an earlier, too strongly formulated statement, right? So it's not that we think the hypothesis is false. We just think it's inadequate for many of the real world cases that Kristina and I are interested in explaining. Perhaps the hypothesis works for some highly circumscribed set of cases, but for many real life cases, the hypothesis doesn't stand up. And here's one example, just to get you in the mood. I'm currently in the process of editing these book chapters for a collection that's slated to come out next year, or maybe it'll come out in 10 years. I'm not actually sure. And it's been as people who have edited for collections before might know, it's been a nightmare for me, in no small part because I have no idea when the chapters are going to show up. Although I have since discovered there's no correlation between my asking for a chapter and it's showing up in my inbox. So at least that's one mystery solved. But I know that even though I don't know when they're going to show up, I also know that I can't just drop whatever I'm doing as a matter of policy and start editing a chapter whenever one happens to get sent to me. So even though I have as part of my plan the intention to edit book chapters, I cannot formulate as part of this plan some aspect of the appropriate timing because too little is known in advance about when the occasions for acting will arise. I adopt instead a plan that's partial, vague, or indeterminate with respect to some of these critical details, but it still functions to constrain and inform part of my deliberation. So to fill in these details on the fly, Kristina and I think that instead these local assessments generate judgments about how to apportion plans over time. And these judgments account for the content of the total set of intentions. So when you make these kinds of assessments, you're thinking about what are all the things that I want to accomplish in the short, medium, and long term, right? In essence, the plan. But you're also accounting for a range of factors that are extrinsic to the content of the plan. Here are two examples that are meant to illustrate what these local assessments pick up on. And they're also, I think, supposed to show that acting on a plan or activating a component of a plan isn't always initiated by perceiving an occasion that matches the content of a timestamp. So in example one, suppose that some individual performs an action over an interval, but reaches a point where they can do either one thing or another. For instance, the baby's now asleep, so I can either B or C, both of which I had previously planned to accomplish at some point. It's open to me to do either. And so the judgment that prompts either my being or seeing, right, my judgment that prompts my moving down one path or the other, isn't a function of just inspecting the content or corresponding beliefs of my intentions to either B or C. Now note that this example allows that the initial interval, that period of A-ing, might have been unexpected. I didn't expect the baby to wake up when she did, but now that she's settled down, I can shift back to something else. It would have been no part of my originally planning to do B or C that they occur only once the baby has gone to sleep. So the notion of a timestamp operating here would overly rigidify the implementation of my plan, which doesn't align with how I actually or typically act over time in daily life. Instead of perceiving a match between some timestamp and the current situation, we think that there are these local assessments that prompt judgments about how best to carry forward one's plans. So these local assessments, they integrate over information about what remains to be done with respect to one's plan. So it's the elements of the overall conduct plan, the costs and benefits of pursuing particular components relative to others, the prospects of accomplishing other parts of the plan relative to completing other parts now. And we're going to talk about that more later. Right. So these are just some of the kinds of information that might play a role in these assessments. And some information that might play crucially important roles in my current deliberation about what to do now and how to act on my plan would not have seemed relevant from the standpoint of initially forming the plan. So as I mentioned earlier, right, the baby waking up earlier than expected was, by definition, unexpected. And perhaps now I'm more tired than I anticipated being at this point in the day. Because being is being in this sense, not like B-E-I-N-G, but being in terms of the example, is a more cognitively demanding task. This might incline me toward doing C, but that's not because my intention to C includes some information like do this when you feel tired. Instead, it's an assessment that accounts for what I want to do and my current status and what I expect of the world moving forward. Here's another example. I'm currently writing, but eventually I need to get around to filling out some job applications. I could switch now, or I could switch in an hour. Either is open to me, at least given what I currently know. And the judgment to switch or persist doesn't arise from inspecting the content of the intentions, but is instead a judgment about what I think will put me in a good position to accomplish most of my plan moving forward. But the information that's relevant to my position and the prospects of accomplishing my plan are not always scrutable from the standpoint of plan formation. So we think that these examples illustrate why the timestamp hypothesis fails to adequately characterize acting on a plan, at least for some real-world cases. At various points, the way that I apportion my plan over time derives from a practical judgment that incorporates more information than is included in the content of the intentions. We think that this means that planning agents have to be appropriately reactive to the circumstances in which their plans unfold. And these local assessments of how a plan is going, one's current state, and how the world may or may not cooperate in the future inform judgments about how to move through one's plan. So these assessments manifest in agents' vigilance. And here vigilance is kind of a technical term that we're defining that somewhat departs from the usage that might be familiar to people coming from cognitive psychology and thinking about sustained attention paradigms. So or at least my notion, I'm not going to speak for Kristina, but my notion of vigilance here is sort of a stipulated technical definition. This vigilance constitutes a form of maintaining awareness, both of where one is with respect to a given plan and where one projects to go. And we think vigilance is what constitutes the capacity for temporally extended agency, or what we're calling now then control. And that label, the purpose of that label is really to distinguish what we're talking about, this form of cross-temporal organization or cross-temporal self-governance, from the kinds of top-down forms of control that are familiar from the self-control literature. And the two are distinct, we think, because they play different functional roles in our agency. So top-down control is meant to align our behavior with judgments about what we think it's best to do in the face of temptation or weakness of will, or occasions that prompt weakness of will. Now then control also aligns behavior with these kinds of practical judgments, but its function is to achieve this kind of cross-temporal organization. So if you go back and think about the skipping case, the agent fails to align behavior with a practical judgment about what to do, but the failure doesn't result from succumbing to temptation or experiencing weakness of will. Instead, it's a failure to maintain awareness of one's behavior in light of one's plans. And so this is what we would call a failure of vigilance. And it's importantly different from the kinds of failures of self-control when people give into temptations. So a key aspect of vigilance that we're highlighting here is that it enables flexible apportioning of agency over time to pursue multiple goals on indeterminate or overlapping timescales, while also responding to unexpected changes in the circumstances within which one's plan unfolds. So rather than saying that every adjustment of a plan results in the agent forming a new plan, we think that vigilance produces judgments about how to apportion oneself relative to a plan without wholesale forming a new one each time there needs to be adjustment. So I think there's an analogy that can help to illustrate this difference between the two. It's admittedly imperfect, but I think that I think that its imperfections are outweighed by the benefit of the illustration. So I don't know how many people will remember this. I hardly remember this. And if this might not resonate with some of our European friends, but in the old days before GPS, like in the 90s, when you wanted to go on a road trip, you could actually send your starting location and your destination to your local AAA office, and they would produce these booklets called triptychs. And triptychs are little sections of the map that mark out turn-by-turn directions. And so they would draw, you could see here, they would draw with little highlighter the route that you were supposed to take over a 100-mile stretch. And if you were traveling over 100 miles, you'd have to flip the page and it would give you the next 100-mile stretch and so on until you reached your destination. And you can see here on this example, they would even stamp things like construction here for this road, or things like many arrests reported, to give a sense for some of the on-the-ground information that was known at the time. So we think that this is kind of an analogy for planning on the timestamp model, right? So when you formulate a plan, you also implicitly include a bunch of information about when and how to switch and alternate between different components within the plan. And if for some reason something unexpected happened, like an accident occurs the morning that you start your trip, you would need to have another triptych available to provide entirely new directions, or you could try to navigate blind if that's your preferred method. The vigilance model, on the other hand, functions more like a Google Map app. So you put in your destination, an initial route is generated, but the route can be altered if something unexpected happens. It can also be altered to reflect changes in your preferences. So perhaps at a certain point you decide, you know what, I want to take the PCH on my way back home rather than the 101, because maybe you just have tons of free time. That change can actually be implemented mid-route in order to get you to your destination, along with other parameters, and it can be done on the fly. So the analogy is imperfect. Again, I think partly because driving doesn't have this sort of switching characteristic, the switching feature that's characteristic of scattered actions. But we think that this usefully illustrates the difference in flexibility between plans that include timestamps and plans that rely on vigilance. Okay, so last step here before we get to Kristina, we've talked about how vigilance produces these local assessments that issue in judgments about how to switch or persist across plan components. What we want to talk about now is what kind of information vigilance integrates over in making these local assessments. In particular, we want to extrapolate some predictions that are drawn from reward-based decision-making and reinforcement learning paradigms, focusing in particular on the expected value of control theory, which is a framework for describing the allocation of cognitive control across task sets, and abstracting that framework to the psychological level to illustrate the functional profile of vigilance. So just very briefly as background on the expected value of control framework, it's a set of computational principles of control allocation or how control is allocated to some task set based on the expected value of allocating control to that task set, weighted against the expected value of letting that task set operate on its default settings. So you can think of this as it's trying to maximize expected reward while minimizing expected effort, which is sort of the novel twist on the speed accuracy trade-off that it has. There's this engineering principle in the background that informs the EVC, and that's that our cognitive architecture is structured roughly to rely on a large system of default settings and a sparse number of control units or task managers that monitor for conflict among the systems that utilize default settings and intervening only when necessary to make adjustments. So broadly speaking, then, with that sort of framework in mind, cognitive control gets allocated to some task set based on expected value of allocating control to one task set weighted against letting that system run on defaults versus the value of allocating control to a different task set. So there's been a lot of work recently on the expected value of control, but we're going to focus on just some of the core algorithms that form part of the EVC, because we think that those can actually inform some psychological predictions for how agents act over time. So 2 equations. This first one describes the general parameters for determining the expected value of control for a contextually bounded signal. So first, here you see the value of a signal is partly a function of the expected probability of achieving some outcome, given that this contextually bounded signal is sent. Right? So in other words, it's the probability of achieving success, given that control gets allocated to that particular task set. That gets combined with this total estimated value of the outcome. This value component actually has 2 parts that we're going to talk about later. So let's leave that aside for a second. So there's this total value that's combined with the probability of success. That's sort of the benefit side of your cost benefit analysis. And that brings us to the cost side of the cost benefit analysis. So you get this cost element that's subtracted from the probability reward component. So on the EVC, at least it's formulated by many of its proponents, these costs incorporate both an opportunity cost of allocating control to one task set rather than another, but also this intrinsic cost of allocating control. I'll note as a side note, the idea that there is an intrinsic cost of control that's distinct from opportunity costs is a controversial claim, matter of some debate. Conceptually speaking, I haven't gotten entirely clear on what the difference is between the two. And it seems like when people try to describe intrinsic costs, they end up talking about opportunity costs. That could just be a failure on my part, but I at least want to flag that is a contentious aspect of this model, that there are intrinsic costs. If you don't like that, you can just think of these as opportunity costs. When we look at the value component, there's this intuitively obvious element that represents the immediate reward, or the rewards that are associated just with being in the relevant outcome state, that's abstracted from everything else. However, there's this additional component that represents the availability of expected future rewards based on your getting to the outcome by allocating some amount of control. So this is supposed to reflect a temporally bounded element to the computation of the expected value of control. So what I mean by that is that the value of outcomes is sensitive to how you achieve or how you get to the outcome and how that sets you up for future rewards. So you might have this extremely immediately rewarding outcome state, but it requires so much effort to get there that your prospects for future reward based on being in that outcome state are actually quite low. When you compare that to an outcome state that is less immediately rewarding, but also sets you up for much greater rewards in the future, you can see how that would be a more totally valuable outcome state, even though it is less immediately rewarding. So there's sort of this temporal component to the way that value is calculated. So from this, we can get a sense for the kinds of information that inform the allocation of control. The probability of reward is certainly important, but so too is a comparison of expected effort. If the probability of reward only marginally increases based on a huge expenditure of effort, then the expected value of control is lower overall. There are also comparisons over multiple task sets, as well as prospective judgments about the possibility of future rewards. From this perspective, I think the EVC is really just a framework that explains reward maximization bounded by the need for efficiency. But notice that at the level we've presented it, many of these considerations map onto how we've described deliberations about apportioning agency over time. So when people are making these local assessments about whether to switch or persist across their plan components, the information about expected reward and effort are relevant. That is something that people think about. But so too are considerations about how pursuing certain parts of a plan position one for completing other parts of a plan later. So we think that we can use the EVC as a model to extract norms for making assessments about how to apportion agency over time, or norms of practical reasoning that relate to planning. Kristina and I, and here we're going to set up the transition to the more empirical part of the talk. We believe that the EVC framework can actually be used to generate psychological predictions about how people act on their plans. We think this also informs new ways of understanding how participants engage with prospective memory and vigilance tasks. Vigilance here in its more common usage of sustained attention task. Kristina is going to present the results of an experiment that was developed with this idea in mind, although as Kristina is going to emphasize, and I'm going to emphasize it too, we didn't test specific predictions of the EVC in this experiment. We used some of its principles in thinking about how to structure the experiment. But testing specific predictions is something that we hope to do in the future. So with that, I'm going to let Kristina take control.
Okay. Thanks, Samuel. Before we take over with Kristina, I suggest that we just very briefly take questions of understanding, if there are any questions of understanding, because there were two comments in the chat. Perhaps we can just do that now. No big picture conceptual questions, just small questions of understanding. We can have a full discussion later on after the two talks. Benjamin, do you want to unmute yourself? I don't know if you can, but let's give it a try. Benjamin Pittman-Pauletta.
Great. Yeah, hi. So my question was just about this cost of the signal as opposed to like effort. What's the difference between those two? Where does effort show up here? And what is the cost of the signal? When you mentioned the cost of the signal, I thought effort was part of it. So if you have a
yeah, that was some sloppiness on my part. So at least in terms of this framework, the experience of effort is supposed to be a phenomenological correlate of these opportunity cost calculations. So when you experience something as being highly effortful, that is supposed to correspond to this idea that you're currently persisting on a task when you could be doing something that is more rewarding and it's available. So effort is sort of the phenomenology side of these computations, and so you can think of the costs as representing the experience of effort or under the hood.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, if there are no more, there was some comments in the chat, but if nobody raises their hand, then I suggest we continue with Kristina's part, and then there's still time for questions at the end and for a general discussion. So Kristina, go ahead.
All right, thanks. I have control of Sam's computer now. So as Sam introduced, this is going to be talking about perspective memory. And perspective memory is, broadly speaking, the memory to do the intended action sometime in the future. An event-based perspective memory specifically is more likely to be recalled when an agent perceives some sort of associated cue in the environment. So to ground this definition in the context of an example that Sam provided us earlier, if your intention was to go from the office, stop at the library to check out a book before then going home, your memory to stop at the library might be recalled once you actually see the library itself along your walk through campus. So in this way, the library kind of serves as a prospective memory cue that triggers your recall to go check out the book. So successful prospective memory requires a coordination of kind of a lot, including whatever strategies that you adopt to try to remember to do this intention, as well as kind of a cascading a series of neurocognitive operations that help support things like memory, cue perception, and attention, cue perception, and memory recall. But in virtue of how we typically measure successful prospective memory, it also requires you to actually perform the intended task. So it's hard to, unless you get somebody to self-report that they recall their memory, it's hard to really truly understand, did you have prospective memory recall in the scope of a experimental session? So instead, we try to measure behavioral responses of completing the intended task. So it seems somewhat intuitive to think that if you increase the perceived value of the prospective task, you would also probably increase your likelihood of remembering that important task compared to ones that are just slightly less important. But those who would make that assumption might be interested to know that the empirical research has been much more mixed in this regard. That is, studies of prospective memory that have manipulated the perceived value of the prospective task have sometimes yielded better, worse, and sometimes no difference in prospective memory. And so discussions on trying to disentangle why this is has led to sort of an analysis of how top-down motivation might play an important role. So an agent might be more highly motivated to complete a very important prospective intention, but this might also interact with how demanding the current task is. So this gets a little bit at Benjamin's question about effort, or the cost of doing whatever it is that you're doing might kind of consume your ability to detect the relevant cue in your environment and lead you to not recall your prospective memory. There's also been some more nuanced discussions about how like the specific paradigms are kind of structured in a certain way that might encourage value to have more or less of an impact. But generally speaking, I think I'm convinced, and I think I've convinced Sam as well, that these discussions have by and large failed to provide a comprehensive understanding of the impact of value on prospective memory, because they fail to consider how increasing the value of the prospective memory might also change the way the prospective memory cue is cognitively and neurally processed, kind of independently of any sort of influence from top-down motivation or task demands or task strategies. So this was a question that Sam and I, as well as colleagues from Duke, have explored in a recent publication, shameless plug for our new article in cerebral cortex communication. But in this task, we asked participants to adopt a fictional narrative where they were supposed to be serving lunches to high school students. And the majority of these students were supposed to just receive a standard lunch, which was denoted by a repetitive same button response every time over and over that they saw a face stimulus. They were also told that very select few students were to receive an alternative lunch to avoid food-specific allergies. So participants learned who these individuals were ahead of their main task, and they were 3 individuals who were to receive a dairy-free lunch. Otherwise, participants told that these students could receive a stomach ache. 3 other students were to receive a peanut-free lunch. Otherwise, they could experience anaphylactic shock and die. So probably rightfully so, we operationalized these individuals as moderate prospective memory cues and these individuals as severe prospective memory cues. And that's how I will refer to them here on out. So after learning who these students were, participants completed a cued memory recall test in which they saw a face and had to report whether this particular individual was to receive a standard lunch, a dairy-free lunch, or a peanut-free lunch. And they were given feedback on their performance at this stage. Embedded in this memory test were 6 individuals who participants learned ahead of time were to receive the standard lunch in the main lunch serving task. And I will refer to them as these learned controls. This is in contrast to how the majority of the other phase stimuli that appeared in the main lunch serving task were not previously learned in this encoding phase of the experiment. And so how this main task worked was that after a brief fixation cross, a phase stimulus would appear and participants would have to decide which lunch to deliver to that particular student. And again, the majority of these students were just supposed to receive the standard lunch. So what ends up manifesting is that participants are hitting the same button over and over again until an infrequent prospective memory cue appears, in which, in order to garner a correct response, participants would have to, in a marshal active control, inhibit the repetitive habituated response and then execute the correct button response according to which prospective memory cue that they perceived. So you can already see that this is a very vigilance heavy paradigm in kind of like the standard cognitive control sense. But also a key aspect to this task was that severe cues and moderate cues were interspersed throughout the entire experiment. So this was designed such that participants couldn't necessarily switch their task strategies unequally across the moderate and the severe cues. And even if they were more motivated to respond to the severe than moderate cues, it wasn't the case that this motivation was kind of strategically allocated. It was supposed to just control for those effects over the course of the entire experiment. Okay. So the first thing that we wanted to do is a little bit of a sanity check, was just to make sure that participants were delivering the standard lunch as they were supposed to. Because you can imagine a strategy that participants might adopt is just to, instead of delivering the standard lunch, just delivering the peanut-free lunch over and over again as kind of like a safe, conservative approach to this task. But we did find that performance for the not learned and the learned controls were very high. And so this indicates that participants are indeed hitting that standard button response over and over as they should. Now, just a little caveat here, performance was significantly different between the not learned and learned controls. I think that this is a difference between 99% and 95%. And that just means that 5% of the time for the learned controls, participants were false alarming, delivering an alternative lunch. But I think that the key takeaway here is that the majority of the time, they are hitting that standard button response as they should. Now, it's probably not surprising to know that performance for the prospective memory cues showed a huge deficit. And that makes sense because of just how much extra it takes in order to get a correct response for the prospective memory cues. But the one thing that is kind of important to note here is that the mistakes that were being made for these prospective memory cues were errors of omission. That is, participants were delivering the standard lunch when they ought to have been delivering the alternative lunch. I think it was only like 3% of the time participants delivered the incorrect alternative lunch. So I think it's safe to assume that these are mostly errors of omission. All right, let me get to the more fun stuff about value in our main research question. Behavioral responses were more accurate in response to the severe than the moderate cues. So for those of you who hypothesized that this would be the case, congratulations. That was in fact the case. But important here is that, go forward, there we go. Response times were also much faster for the severe than the moderate cues. So it wasn't necessarily a speed accuracy trade-off going on here. There was a value-based bias in favor of the severe over the moderate cues, as characterized by better and faster responses. Now you'll note here, kind of there's a stark drop off in response times from correct responses to incorrect responses. And also note that there was no response time difference across the two different Q types for incorrect trials. And I'll get a little bit more into why I think that is once we start looking at the neural data. So to first focus on neural responses to prospective memory cues when they actually got the task correct, the results showed that there was a greater parietal positivity in response to the severe than the moderate cues. And a cluster-based permutation analysis confirmed these results, as denoted here by these little stars in the central parietal region. But once we looked at the ERP traces, we believe that this greater parietal positivity is actually better characterized as an earlier parietal positivity in response to the severe than the moderate cues. And importantly, this earlier neural response paralleled but preceded the faster behavioral response to the severe than the moderate cues. So there's a lot that kind of to take away from this, but it's first really important to understand, well, what is this parietal positivity that seems to be paralleling the behavioral responses? So past studies of prospective memory have loosely identified this parietal positivity as reflecting full cue recognition, but they've also been able to kind of decompose this parietal positivity into three unique components. So the first one in the series is the kind of classic P3 infrequent target processing ERP component. Quickly following that is, again, the classic parietal old new effect, which, surprise, surprise, is a greater parietal positivity in response to previously learned than new stimuli. It's a great name for that effect. And then last but not least is the prospective positivity, which is thought to be a little bit more prospective memory specific and likely reflects prospective memory recall and or the kind of setting up a new attentional set to in preparation of the later motor response. Okay. Interestingly, we also found this faster cue recognition for the severe than the moderate cues in trials where participants responded incorrectly. It's just the case that this earlier parietal positivity occurred after the behavioral response was already initiated. And so what we think is going on here is that participants are not engaging in the necessary active control processes to inhibit the behavioral response. They just sort of kind of fire it off before they have any sort of full cue recognition. And that full cue recognition is showing a value bias in favor of the more important prospective memory. Okay, so to briefly summarize what I've kind of already said, in this very constrained experimental paradigm, where we try to control for the impact of top-down motivation as well as changes in task strategies, we find that increasing the perceived value of the prospective task introduces this value-based bias in cue recognition. And we think that it's best characterized as an earlier parietal positivity, and probably given the sequence of components that make up this parietal positivity, as a little bit of a caveat, we do think it's probably characterized by an earlier P300, although I'll leave open the possibility that those other ERP components are also somehow impacted by perceptions of value. But one of the key takeaways for this talk is that we do think that this value bias exists even in the incorrect responses. It's just that the cue is not fully recognized, and therefore the value bias isn't fully kind of instantiated in time for any sort of impact on the behavioral response. People are just sort of kind of firing off the habituated response without any sort of full engagement of what it is that they're perceiving, like what cue it is that they're perceiving. So I want to make one more point, and I did not write this down on purpose. So that way there's no written evidence of this claim that I'm about to throw out there and then not talk about any further. I'll deny having said this if anyone asks me later on.
There is a video recording of this session.
Oh, dang it. I failed to think about that. But the one part of this that Sam and I have sort of started to further extrapolate from is that given the nature of the mistakes being made, that they're errors of omission, and given the fact that the incorrect response seems to occur prior to any sort of full cue recognition, we think what participants are doing throughout the majority of this task is relying on more reactive strategies in order to identify the prospective memory cues. So we don't think it's the case that on every single face that pops up, participants are kind of proactively scanning that face and making sort of this proactive decision about like what it is that they're looking at. We think that participants are sort of either intentionally disengaging or somehow just relying on a more reactive strategy to, or just trying to rely on the salience of this particular stimulus popping up and then thinking that they can respond to it in time. And when they can't, that's when we see these errors of omission. So what I'm going to do is hand this back to Sam so that we can zoom out away from the nitty-gritty of the empirical study and see how this fits within kind of a more broad context.
Perhaps we can just very briefly give people time to ask for questions of understanding.
Yeah.
Not big conceptual questions, not debates, but just like brief questions of understanding.
Yeah.
If not, then let's just, Walter, go ahead.
So I just want to ask why you keep calling it an error of omission, because the error is to give a meal to somebody that's going to be harmed by that meal. That sounds like a commission of harm.
That's actually a really great point. I hadn't thought about it in that context. I was calling it an error of omission because it was not delivering an alternative lunch. So rather than delivering an alternative lunch incorrectly, which I have previously conceived to be an error of commission, that you're giving an alternative lunch, it's just the wrong one. But that's actually a really good point. I should maybe stop referring to it as an error of omission. It's an error of delivering the standard lunch.
I don't think it affects your main point. I was just wondering where that terminology came from.
Yeah.
Okay, if there are no more questions of understanding, Adina, go ahead.
Yeah, mine may be a little more conceptual, but I'm not entirely clear on why you think this is a prospective memory task and not just a target detection task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually a great question. And Sam, this is why I wanted to include that slide that I hid. So I don't know what the best way to get to those traces are in the slide that I hid.
That's a good point.
Just go through your slides. We'll all close our eyes.
Yeah, it's this one right here.
There we go.
So in order to see that this is where those learned controls become important, because the learned controls are also sort of a target, if you will, because they are previously learned stimulus. And again, I skipped over this because it was not like the concern of our value bias, but we were able to plot out or to identify the ERP traces that are traditionally thought to reflect prospective memory. So in here, the gray trace is just the not learned controls, the light blue are the learned controls, and then the green are the prospective memory. And in this parietal, in the latency of the parietal positivity, we do show a substantially larger parietal positivity in response to the prospective memory cues than the learned controls, because the learned controls are also an infrequent target. It's just that they just receive the same lunch as the not learned controls, which were also substantially a lot lower. And so what we believe is that the fact that this parietal positivity was substantially larger, you are getting kind of perspective memory specific processing that's going on somewhere in that parietal positivity. As I mentioned, it's 3 components, 2 of which are more kind of target detection and 1 that's more perspective memory specific.
There are slightly different uses of the term perspective memory in psychology and in cognitive neuroscience. For example, in psychology, people often understand that as you'll have a phase where you're not thinking about the thing you want to do. Whereas in cognitive neuroscience, people often mean with that, they mean attention to do something later with some kind of delay, not explicitly assessing whether you're deliberately thinking about it in the intermittent period. And the kind of the infrequency of the prospective memory cues is like a standard manipulation in the prospective memory literature. So like you do one thing all the time, you have these kind of standard non-recognized faces, you're pressing the same button all the time, and then suddenly something comes along, and then you have to do something different. That's like a standard kind of way of operationalizing prospective memory in the behavioral literature. There is no more question. There was a comment, but why not? We can just see.
I think there was a question about time pressure.
Yeah.
And there was, the face remained on the display for only 600 milliseconds, and then participants had an additional 800 to 1000 milliseconds to make a response.
Okay. Well, if anyone has more questions, we've got plenty of discussion time later on. But let's get back to Samuel for the wrap up, back to the conceptual perspective.
Yeah. Okay, this last part is short, so we get to the questions quickly. So we've considered this somewhat narrow, tightly controlled situation in trying to think about how individuals apportion their agency over time. And so what, just to wrap up or summarize, to put a close on this, we want to, as Kristina said, zoom back out to the larger view into some sort of real life situations to think about how this framework might be pressed into service for explaining what happens outside of the lab. So why does skipping happen, right? So think of this case that we mentioned at the beginning. Why does that sort of thing happen? I think what's important to remember is that skipping is something that could only happen to a planning agent. And I think that's because it manifests this unique way that planning agents apportion themselves with respect to scattered actions and devote their limited cognitive resources to multiple task sets over time. So let's consider the following graphic. This was made for a different purpose, but there's an element of this will be important. So let's consider the following sort of graphical representation of what's happened when the agent doesn't skip, right? So you've got this agent who has 3 desires. They want to work, they want to get the book from the library, and they want to go home and grade. That informs 3 different intentions. Now they can't be executed all at once. You can't be working and getting the book from the library and grading and so what happens is it gets formulated into this plan for how this series of behaviors will get executed. Right? And so when skipping doesn't happen, you get this sort of structure. The agent leaves the office to head to the car, switches to getting the book from the library, and then goes back to going to their car to drive home for the evening. Right? That's what it would look like if there's no skipping. So what happens with skipping is to sort of jump over this middle part here, and we just leave the office and go straight to the car. I think now that we've got this framework in place, we can give the following description of what's going on. Slightly idealized, but again, useful for illustrating the framework. So upon leaving the office, I'm faced with 2 options. I can either have the intention to go to the library at the forefront of my mind, at the exclusion of all other things, and use that to guide my behavior directly to the library. Or the other option I have is that I can think about something else and rely on the library or perceiving the library to cue the recall of the intention to go get the book. Now, because the visual cue is so salient, right, the option of just relying on the library seems somewhat attractive because it frees up some of my mental resources to continue thinking about these work things that I am interested in thinking about. Another way to think about this is that the probability of getting the book isn't raised enough relative to the amount of effort I have to expend by keeping that intention at the forefront of my mind. Right? So what I'm doing is I'm relying somewhat on the context to regulate my intention as part of carrying out my plan. So what happens when the agent skips getting the book, and here's where we get some of like how quality of will gets incorporated into acting over time. When the agent skips getting the book, it doesn't manifest that the agent doesn't really care about getting the book. Right? I mean, that might be what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Right? Instead, we could say that the agent is overconfident in the reliability of offloading part of acting on the plan to the environment. Right? So they expected the environment to do something to scaffold their planning. And that's where the failure enters in. But that need not manifest some sort of deficit of care. All these desires on the left-hand side could be equally strong, and you could still get this kind of skipping case that's happening over here on the right. So what we've added is there's, in a sense, an account of how strong are the desires that inform different parts of the plan components. And there's also some sort of calculation about what's the probability of being able to achieve different parts of these plan based on apportioning different degrees of agency to the components. And that gives you a more nuanced understanding of how agents might apportion their actions over time, or how they might scatter their actions over time. Okay, so with that, we want to give some thanks to people that have helped us with the process. I especially want to thank Santiago Amaya. We're currently working on some other projects in Temporal Extended Agency, and a lot of that has informed my thinking, some that shows up here. So I wanted to give a shout out to him, and also to Walter and Felipe, who invited us to SNAP and originally got us thinking about these different projects. So yeah, thanks to everybody for listening to us, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Fantastic. Thanks, Samuel and Kristina, for this really great presentation and for this exemplary attempt at merging conceptual issues with empirical work. So really well done. And Walter seems to be dug in to ask lots of questions. So why don't you just start? But everyone else is very warmly invited to ask questions of understanding, support, challenges, whatever. Go ahead. So Walter.
So I want to ask, I mean, it might seem like a kind of off the wall question, but I'm interested in how much of the same processes you think occur, you know, in animals. For example, a frog that doesn't notice a fly and then doesn't, you know, stick out its tongue and catch it. It's not being vigilant. Is that the same thing, or is there something different going on in humans?
Well, I personally have some opinions about the cognitive capacity of my little puppy, which is far superior than my own. But I don't know. I don't know how the extent to which an animal can plan above and beyond kind of the immediate future. And if this is something that's uniquely human about us. Especially given the, so just in the scope of perspective memory itself, the extent of cognitive capacity that you, and cognitive operations that need to be perfect in order to get successful perspective memory may be above and beyond the sort of executive control that exists in animals compared to humans. I don't know. I know, Sam, that you have also talked about, like, you've written on differences between like animals and consciousness in humans. Do you have?
Yeah, but not, so I also don't know, but the reason I don't know is because a key part of this, a key part of the explanatory framework here is that it's not just that it's not just this explanation applies to planning agents, but it's that planning agents who utilize partial or indeterminate plans and then rely on what we're calling vigilance to fill them in over time. And I'm not sure, and that's what I'm not sure. I'm not sure if animals, non-human animals, utilize partial plans in the way that human beings do. If they did, then I would say this account applies to them. And at some level, the processes are probably the same. But if they don't, if the representations they form are always fully determinate, then I think probably they're not utilizing scattered agency in the way that we are.
Okay, thanks very much. I suggest that we alternate between discussionists and participants with the questions. So next up we have Adinamius, and then we continue with Adina, and then Randolph Clark, and then Pamela. Okay?
Great, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks for a really interesting project. My question's just really open-ended, and you can go into as much or a little detail as you want, but I was wondering if you wanted to say something about the role of consciousness in this model, and when you think the agent needs to be conscious in order to unskip or get back on track, whether or not there's some sort of role for consciousness in terms of being required for vigilance, and whether, those are sort of access consciousness questions, but you mentioned phenomenal consciousness when you talked about effort and in control. And so I don't know if you want to say something about that too. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll jump in briefly again first, again, kind of speaking just within the narrow scope of the perspective memory paradigm that I presented on. I do think that the question does sort of center around the extent to which unconscious processing of the perspective memory queue could still sort of trigger perspective memory recall. And there has been some debate about this, because about like, what is a perspective memory queue and why does it have to be any one kind of any one queue that is linked to one perspective memory? Can't you have multiple cues that can trigger perspective memory, and the extent to which you have to cognitively or you have to consciously process that information in order for it to elicit a perspective memory cue. So for example, if you're walking through campus, maybe you didn't explicitly see the library or consciously see the library, but it still somehow influenced the perspective memory recall. So I think to answer your question, that would be sort of a necessary step to understand the extent to which unconsciously processed information can trigger perspective memory recall.
Yeah, this risk becoming such a big question. So I have two thoughts. I mean, sort of abstracting from the experimental details. I think there are two stages that you could isolate, and consciousness plays a different role in either of them. So there's one stage is responding to unexpected changes or responding to incoming information that then triggers some kind of deliberation about whether you need to adjust the plan. I think because that involves some deliberation, that has got to involve some kind of conscious awareness or conscious information processing, or wherever you think the consciousness is showing up. I do think that, so Kristina mentioned this, that agents, and I guess I mentioned it too, agents can shift between engaging in or carrying out a plan more reactively or more proactively. I think that those kinds of shifts are not always mediated by conscious processes. And so in a sense, there are the things that there's a way that you structure a plan. Some of those components will sort of occupy the scope of your current awareness. And then you're relying on some of these processes that are under the hood, so to speak, to trigger recall of intentions and bring those into a current awareness at the right time. I think there's a larger story to tell about how we can, or how people set up or structure their plans initially such that they can exercise some level of control over those shifts between reactive and proactive. But I think that their unconscious processes are going to play a large role. And so in that sense, vigilance isn't something, and I think we mentioned at the beginning, vigilance isn't something that's always fully mediated by conscious states.
Okay, thanks very much. Adina is up next.
Thanks. Thank you for the pair of talks. They were really lovely. I think my question is aimed a little bit more at your part, Sam. So it sounded to me like you were trying to revise sort of the standard view of intention as hierarchical and temporally extended different levels. So this the idea that a plan could be a abstract higher order intention that's then sort of articulated at various levels until it becomes something like a motor intention. And I guess I wasn't sure exactly what it was about the traditional picture that can't accommodate this kind of switching or dispositional story. So I wondered if you could just clarify that for me.
Sure. So I guess the reason why I think the standard story, or at least, I guess I'm hesitant because not always clear to me what the standard story is, but insofar as I understand it, if you think of that sort of schematic representation of a scattered action, there are places where you're pursuing one part of a plan. So if you thought of the plan as just a set of or a structured set of intentions, there are points where like one intention is active relative to the others, and then there's this period where you shift from acting on one intention to acting on another. And I think that a shortcoming of the standard model, maybe not a problem with it, but just shortcoming, is that I don't think that those shifts are accounted for simply by appealing to the content of an intention or the guidance that's afforded by an intention. So that was what I think is, and from there, what we want to do is sort of make two arguments. The one is there's more to a plan than just a collection of intentions. There's also some information about how you're going to apportion yourself across those different activities over time. But then there's also this further capacity that is taking in information and adjusting that plan in response to changes in information. And again, I think all of that is happening, that's sort of independently of the intentions. So I don't know if that clarifies.
Yeah, I guess so. So, yeah. I mean, I guess what you're saying is it's not that standard picture isn't compatible with your view. It's that your view is addressing a part of that picture that's at least not articulated within the picture, right? So, I mean, there's nothing in the old picture saying, well, you can't, that there's nothing stopping executive function from, stopping the execution of one intention and switching to some other intention or something, but that's not built into the picture in any explicit way. Is that?
That's right. Yeah, right. I shouldn't say, it's not that it's incompatible. It's just this is additional stuff that's going on that's not really discussed as part of that literature on intention.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Oh, sorry, Jen, I think you were muted.
My mouse pointer is very slow. I'm sorry. Next up, we have a second question from the participants, Randolph Clark.
Hi, yeah, thanks. So this question about something, Sam, you said towards the very end, you were considering explanations of skipping and argued that, well, it's not always explained by, say, failure to care sufficiently about a certain task. You mentioned instead it might be explained by overconfidence, that one will notice the relevant cue. And so it occurred to me, I mean, one way of understanding overconfidence is that one is unreasonably confident, but I'm not sure that's what you meant. But but it occurred to me that that needn't be true either, that your confidence isn't borne out, but it could have been perfectly reasonable nonetheless. So I was wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So you might have, or let me see if I understand. So it is, you could have an accurate belief about the likelihood of the library triggering recall the intention. And it just so happened that this day you landed in the unlucky sort of 10% range where it just doesn't, you don't perceive it. That's
Yeah. So you might have a very good record of going to the library in this sort of situation when that's what you plan to do, but it doesn't work this time.
Yeah, I think that's, well, and I think the fact that you have a good record also partly informs how you structure your plans and which parts of your plans you sort of offload to the environment. I think that I'm hesitating because I think this sort of builds into a larger story about, or it gets me start thinking about the story about responsibility. So if it turns out that you're sort of have an accurate level of confidence and you just happen to fail this time, what does that mean in terms of culpability? I think probably at this, when you're walking past the library, I think it's accurate to say that there's a failure of vigilance. So this makes me think that it's probably this be qualified not in terms of its overconfidence. What Kristina and I want to avoid is saying that anytime you neglect part of your plan, that the way to explain that is that you didn't exhibit a sufficient level of care, or your desire for accomplishing that part of the plan was weaker relative to the parts of the plan that you persisted on. So maybe overconfidence isn't the right word. It's just that there's something that informs how you apportioned that plan that doesn't have anything to do with the strength of your desires relative to the different components, but instead reflects the way in which you think the world is going to interact with helping you execute that plan. And that's not to import any sort of normative evaluation of how you happen to be apportioning that plan. So it's just a separate question from the culpability. It's just, we wanted to figure out some way of explaining how those sorts of breakdowns happen without just attributing a deficit of quality of will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
I would like to
Okay.
also add a little bit of a
Oh.
nuance. Yeah, I just want to add one little nuance to that, because I do think on a much smaller scale, you see an example of this in the empirical study, because you do have the value bias in cue recognition, even when you failed to identify the prospective memory cue in time for it to impact your behavioral response. And so in this sort of situation, it might be over extrapolating from our results. So I will admit to that, but it seems to be an example of, like, it's not necessarily that you didn't in some way value the severe cue. You did. It's just that you didn't necessarily perceive it and recognize it in time in order for it to impact your behavior. So that could be what we want to take from that, is use that as a potential framework to analyze a situation in which you're walking by a library and you fail to detect it, and therefore fail to go in and remember to check out your book.
Okay, thanks. Next up, Pamela.
Yeah, thank you. This was really interesting. So first, just a comment. It struck me that some of what you're talking about here is the sort of thing that people who suffer from ADD have difficulty with, and that might be a source of information to look at. But my larger question, I noticed that you were, just in the way you were presenting things, you would move from the thought that something was not conscious or recurrent to the thought that it was in some way not active or passive or merely dispositional. And I was wondering whether that, whether that made any real difference to your view. Because, and this hooks up to, I think, to Adina's point. So if we went with, so Michael Bratman has a view according to which plans just are intentions, and then they're articulated in the way you suggest, and then he has an issue about their robustness over, they're supposed to have inertia according to him, and Richard Holton have had a conversation about that in press. And it struck me that you were sort of giving a backstory of what that might look like, and that backstory wouldn't need to be understood as something other than the agent themselves actively executing their plans. So I wasn't sure why you were moving to a more dispositional or passive or non-agential way of speaking when giving that backstory.
Thank you for that. I would have to look into that exchange because I was not aware of that. So I guess the first thing is I don't think of dispositions as necessarily, or the dispositional occurrent is sort of cross-cutting the active-passive distinction. Okay. So I think it's just if you think of an intention as I think I mentioned this somewhat elliptically, that if an intention is a state and you think actions are events and only events can be the cause of events, and there's got to be some intermediary that translates the intention into an action. And so Kristina and I had this two-part view where we think in order to explain action over time, you have to have a more complex cognitive state than just a series of intentions. That's the plan. But then you still need something that accounts for that intermediary where there's a translation of that plan into action at the relevant times. So that's where I think the dispositional element is. I also think, I think it's right also to emphasize that it's not passive, because I think just to talk, so Kristina and I also work on mind wandering, or sort of how the stream of consciousness sometimes drifts away from what you're currently doing. And I think, I won't speak for Kristina, but I think that these sorts of intentions, or the parts of your plan that you're not actively carrying out at the moment, sometimes act as nodes or attractors for the stream of consciousness, when what we're doing doesn't really require that we focus on it that much. And so in that way, I think those dispositions can inform sort of how our thinking unfolds over time, and so do exert some, or they do play an active role in how we're thinking, even if we're not currently carrying them out or executing them.
Great, thank you. So I may have been overreading then and thinking that you had aligned those.
No, I should clarify that. That's a good point to make.
And I don't think you need to stick with events cause events, but that's a bigger issue. So I'll cede to Tim.
Back to the question from the chat before we come to Tim O'Connor. My apologies ahead of time if I don't pronounce your name correctly, but I'm going to pronounce it Lucia Fajcic. Please unmute yourself if you want to slap on my fingers for mispronouncing your name. But she raised a question: in what way planning, in your view, is linked with a situated and embodied view of cognition? Is there any link there?
I think Sam and I are both hoping that each other will jump in.
I would say, so I'm going to plead agnosticism here, but it's mostly because the work that I've done really hasn't required me to engage with people that work in the embodied or the inactive space. So it's not that I think the question is interesting. It's I wouldn't even know how to start to answer it. So I'm not sure.
Yeah,
okay.
Unfortunately, I'll have to second that. I think that the closest I've gotten to like embodied cognition in terms of psychology and neuroscience has been how depth perception will change, as opposed, like if you are visualizing things being closer or further away from you. So I don't think that that's relevant at all.
I will say it's an interesting question for,
It is.
for the person who raised this. I missed because I was writing a note for the person. So I think there's sometimes an alignment between kind of anti-representationalism and people who are sort of in the ECS or the inactive framework. And I do think that there is this gap. I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. I'm not sort of initially inclined to think of things in terms of embodied terms, partly as a resistance to anti-representationalism. I think that it's extremely difficult to explain how agents accomplish this kind of planning without appealing to some sort of representational cognitive state. So I do think that would be an interesting thing to look at, is how might people explain the sort of phenomenon where it seems like you really have to be appealing to representations in order to explain this phenomenon. It'd be interesting to see how somebody tried to propose an alternative to that.
Okay, so you did have an answer to the question. Thanks
Yeah,
very much. I suggest, also considering time, we take one more question, Tim, and go ahead.
Okay, so thanks for the talk. We really did, the combined talk, really did enjoy it. My question is, do you see a categorical difference between the scenarios that you are wanting to discuss and give a theoretical analysis of, involving coordination of elements of a preconceived plan in response to cues, environmental cues, and so on, between those scenarios and scenarios in which plans are getting modified on the fly to varying degrees because of the complexity of the situation a person's facing? I mean, I guess the theoretical question in the background here is the coordination function that you hypothesized distinct in kind from that of proximal intention formation?
Well, distinct from proximal intention formation? I think
Yeah, I mean, are they sharply distinct kinds of thing, or can there be blurring of cases?
So I think, so I'll start with with this first part of, is there a category between the cases of coordination and then plans that get adjusted on the fly? I think it's an interesting question. It's something, I laugh because it's something that Kristina and I were talking about yesterday, like whether we had an answer for this kind of question. So I think if you think of the initial examples, I think that we can have these very coarse-grained goals that we really can't have any awareness of the timing or the occasions in which we'd execute them. So if you think of your goals, things like learn Spanish, be healthy, and cultivate some generosity for the holidays. In that sense, I don't think that that's an issue of plans. You might think, look, I've got to think of roughly some ways in which I can start to coordinate these things. So I think that can be distinct from this question about adjustments on the fly, because then there's a case where you can have this initial way in which you think you need to apportion. So I mentioned, here's how I pursue the, being healthy requires the store and the gym and these things at these times, and learning Spanish requires these things at these times, and then papers is these things at these times. And then unexpected things happen that require these on-the-fly adjustments. So I do think that that is different from thinking about how these sorts of coarse-grained goals might fit into a larger tapestry of plans you already have. I mean, one last thing on this is, I think it's somewhat of an idealization to say there's one day where you wake up and you have nothing except a bunch of coarse-grained goals, and so you're just sort of putting them together. I think instead what happens is you start out with this sort of basic stock of things that you want to do today, tomorrow, this week, this month. And then at certain points you adopt, or you can adopt, these larger and then more indeterminate goals. And then I think that is where the coordination comes in that doesn't necessarily involve on-the-fly adjustments. So if there's, maybe a way of or an example to illustrate this, just off the top of my head is, if you woke up one day and you thought, I need to be healthier, right? Well, now you have to sort of think about, how is my day going to change so that I can start to find times where I can go to the gym, or where I can do more shopping rather than eating out. And there you think that's where you're starting to do coordination that's not adjustment. So there, I think you can start to see differences.
Thanks.
Okay, well, let's thank our two brilliant young speakers and for their really intriguing work and for bringing conceptual issues and empirical work so close together. As often, this kind of interesting work shows itself by raising lots of questions, not only answering lots of questions, but also by raising lots of questions. And I scribbled a whole page of ideas down when during the talk, so it was very inspiring. Yeah, I think I might just want to hand back to Uri and Tian if you want to make any final announcements for the next things coming up.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We will have the last of the three in-person, not in person, I wish, early career joint talks. I can just hope the last one will be as good as this one has been and the previous one. Thank you, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.